This episode of the World War II podcast is brought to you by forceswarrecords.co.uk. Forces War Records has over 7 million individual records and a mass of supplementary military data not found on any other websites, and is currently adding over 200,000 records a month. For a 40% discount on 1 month or a year's subscription, use the offer code WW2podcast. Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we'll be looking at the Japanese occupation of the Philippines and the extraordinary stories of those women who escaped internment and helped American prisoners of war and those interned. Joining me is Professor Theresa Kaminski. Theresa's speciality is American women's history at the University of Wisconsin. Her new book, Angels of the Underground, The American Women Who Resisted the Japanese in the Philippines in World War II, tells the story of 4 women who avoided being captured by the Japanese in Manila and were part of a little-known resistance movement. When the Japanese began their brutal occupation of the Philippines in January 1942, 76,000 ill and starving Filipino and American troops tried to hold out on Patan and Corregidor. That spring, having been forced to surrender, most of those men were thrown into Japanese prisoner of war camps, while dozens of others slipped away to organise guerrilla forces. During the 3 violent years of occupation that followed, Allied sympathisers in Manila smuggled supplies and information to the guerrillas and the prisoners. Theresa, thank you for joining me. Shall we start with a quick look at the Philippines? How did they become American?
That goes back to the Spanish-American War and the United States getting involved in helping to relieve Spain of some of its colonial possessions. And, part of that war, of course, took place in Cuba, which the United States very much promoted as a war of liberation for the Cuban people. At the same time that they started sending troops in to help the Cuban revolutionaries, they did the same in the Pacific because Spain had colonized in the Philippines, and the United States decided, well, if there was a fight going on in Cuba, it was probably a good time to help kick the Spanish out of the Philippine Islands, and they essentially gave a boost to the Philippine independence movement. There had been a nationalist movement going on there already.
It's sort of governed by the states. Was there a large American or even European expat community in the Philippines?
By the early 20th century, when the United States took over, there was a fairly large Spanish population because of how long Spain had colonized there. The American population, though, in terms of civilians, never really reached a very large number. And most of them tended to settle on the main island of Luzon, usually in and around Manila. You would find the largest concentration. But most of the statistics that I've seen suggest that between very early 1900s and the start of the war in the Pacific in 41, we're talking about maybe somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 Americans. So if you're really thinking about the Philippines as a country, there was, of course, much more than the island of Luzon. I think there are something like 7,000 small islands to make up that whole group. So it really is a vast country, and the Americans were certainly well outnumbered by people who had been living in the Philippines for much longer. The Americans certainly were a minority population.
So the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in early December 41, they very quickly followed up in the Philippines. I think this is the day after they started making minor landings.
Actually, the attack started the same day as Pearl Harbor. I think what tends to be confusing is that the Philippines are on the other side of the international date line. So most people see that date that the Philippines were attacked on December 8th, and they figure, oh, well, that was the day after Pearl Harbor. But it was actually the same day. So as people in the Philippines were hearing about Pearl Harbor, later that same day, they were also being bombed. It wasn't an actual invasion that same day, but the bombing campaign that laid the foundation for the invasion started at the same time as Pearl Harbor.
When the main invasion came, it all went, very poor from the start for the Americans.
It really did. And there are a lot of very good books that have covered this first part of the war in the Pacific. And that is, of course, the fall of Patan and Corregidor and the Death March. And then a lot of histories of the Pacific War then move on to looking at the various island hopping campaigns. They just say, and the Philippines fell. Then they don't pick up with that until late 44 when MacArthur returned. And so there has been this gap of those occupation years where, you do kind of wonder, well, what did it mean to the people still in the Philippines that they had fallen to the Japanese?
Manila itself was declared a free city. What did that mean for the people within Manila?
It saved them from a great deal of destruction. The purpose of the open city was to discourage the Japanese from really targeting the city for more bombing to try and destroy it before they moved their troops into it. And MacArthur said he would move all of his troops out of the city and just leave it to the civilians, and then hope that the Japanese would be a bit kinder when they moved in. And they generally were. They moved into the city on January 2nd, and it was pretty peaceful. A lot of people were out watching them march in, bicycle in, motor in. The fear, of course, had been that this would be another Nanking, and that did not happen.
Presumably, the able-bodied men had withdrawn with the forces, the American forces, and were left with women, children, old people.
Right. The military forces that had been in Manila, of course, evacuated. A lot of able-bodied civilian men, American men who were there as businessmen and working for the government, whatever they were there doing, many of them did then join the military. So they evacuated to Bataan as well, and MacArthur assumed that once he got his men safely into that peninsula, they could hold out against the Japanese until reinforcements arrived. And this did leave a lot of women and children kind of on their own then in the city.
What did the Japanese do with these nationals? I mean, did they see them as a threat?
They did. For Allied nationals, anyone who was a citizen of one of the Allied countries, so American, British, Australian, Canadian, all of those people were considered to be threats and potential bargaining chips. So the Japanese rounded up the civilians, the Allied civilians, into internment camps. The campus of the Santo Tomas University in Manila was used as the main site of internment for the civilians.
How do they know who is who, as it were? Would they scrutinize lists or?
There was a committee of Americans that had organized, even prior to the invasion, a group of American businessmen who pretty much knew what was going to happen once the Japanese came in. And they started to make a list of American citizens. And they wanted to make sure that any handover was very orderly and nothing that would seem unduly threatening to the Japanese, which might then result in a real catastrophe. So there had been some prior organization, and Santo Tomas had actually been chosen ahead of time by this committee as the best site in the area for a large civilian internment. And then, of course, it was up to the Japanese occupation officials to agree with that. Using these lists, also they set up tables on street corners and just started stopping people as they passed by and made sure that they had them on a registration list so that they could call them up for a roundup and take them to the camp.
To escape internment, was that possible?
It was extremely difficult because I think probably for the first time in their lives, Americans realized that being American did not afford them any special privileges. And as the vast majority of Americans living in the Philippines were Caucasian, their skin color was the first indication that they should not be free to roam the streets. It was very hard for them to hide anywhere. And this made it easier for the roundups, and it also did make it easier for any of the Americans who thought they would even try to hide. They really realized, I think fairly quickly, how difficult that was going to be to stay out of internment or stay out of any sort of arrest situation by the Japanese.
Some did manage to escape internment. How did they get around that?
What they mostly managed to do was to secure false identity papers. And if they could convince the occupation authorities that they were not, in fact, American, and that, of course, was the key. The Japanese wanted Allied nationals concentrated and out of the way. But if they could prove that they were somebody else, then they had a legitimate reason for staying out of internment. So in Manila, for example, there were enclaves of German nationals and even nationals of neutral countries like Switzerland. So it was possible, if you had good fake identity papers, you could stay out of internment.
And even through marriage?
Even through marriage. One of the women in Angels of the Underground is named Gladys Savory, and she and her husband, Andre, ran a very popular French restaurant in Manila. And when the war started in Europe, Andre was called up. He actually ended up back in London at some point, and I've been trying to trace some of this as best I can. But there is also pretty good indication that at this point, when Andre left the Philippines, he and Gladys had probably been divorced. But she still used his name, and everybody in Manila referred to her as Madame Savory. And according to Japanese custom and Japanese law, a woman automatically took the nationality of her husband. So when the occupiers came into Manila, Gladys was actually all packed up and ready to go to internment because she believed she was an American woman. But one of the translators reminded her that no, because of her marriage, she was technically a French citizen. And because the Germans were occupying most of France, the Japanese were willing to leave French citizens out of internment. So that was how Gladys managed to stay out of Santo Tomas. It was an interesting manipulation of the regulations. Now, this didn't prevent her from coming under the scrutiny now and then of occupation authorities, who did from time to time haul her in for questioning, but always let her go. That citizenship issue did hold up for her during the war.
It was a lucky card to be able to play.
It really was, and I think she was a little bit uncertain about that, especially when she saw how many of her friends and acquaintances who went into Santo Tomas, how they were suffering under internment. And I think she felt a little guilty that she was at least free, but the other residents of Manila were not faring particularly well under the occupation. So it's not like she had an easy time during the war, but I think it always bothered her that she wasn't on the inside of Santo Tomas.
What were the conditions like in there?
The first year of internment wasn't bad in terms of the kinds of supplies that could be brought in. The Japanese basically allowed the internees to govern themselves. And there was, it sounds very odd, I'm sure, but there was kind of a small democracy functioning in Santo Tomas where you had elected camp leaders who would then deal with the Japanese. So everything ran pretty smoothly, but the internees were also responsible for their own food. That got increasingly hard to purchase and hard to find. So as the war went on, the people in Santo Tomas were suffering from malnutrition, and just before their liberation, they were close to medical starvation. So the conditions in that camp really just deteriorated throughout the years.
How did they get foodstuffs and supplies in? Did the Japanese give them money to purchase what they want, or did the Japanese give them sort of a staple diet and they were expected to top it up?
A little bit of both. The Japanese provided very basic food items, mostly rice. There was very little then that the Japanese provided beyond that. The internees were expected to find ways, drawing off of their own savings, off of credit lines, off of the kindness of other people living in Manila, to send in food. And this is where Gladys came in. And this is something that I think kind of eased her guilt. Because she had run a restaurant, she knew where the food was in the city. And she did contract with people inside Santo Tomas. She cooked meals. She and her staff cooked meals and had them brought into the internment camp. And she was, for a time, compensated for this. She had customers on the inside who would pay her, but after a while there was no cash, and so she was extending lines of credit. She was using, I think, many of her own reserves just to help these people out.
If life was tough for those, we have all those prisoners, American servicemen, rounded up at the surrender. What was life like for those?
It was infinitely worse. The Americans in Santo Tomas understood that. Many of the women who were interned there had husbands who were in camps like O'Donnell or Cabanatuan. They knew through this underground network that was very rapidly set up, they knew just how bad those conditions were. So the civilians in Santo Tomas always hesitated to complain very much because they knew the military prisoners had it much worse. The Japanese military didn't really recognize soldiers who would surrender. To them, it was just not part of their military code. Any soldier who would surrender was considered to be a lesser human being and therefore did not deserve good treatment. And so they were not treated well in these camps.
Did they get help from people like the Red Cross or?
No. The Japanese, well, I shouldn't say absolutely no, but the Japanese were very restrictive in how they viewed these issues of civilian internment and military prisoners. And for the most part, the Japanese did deny the Red Cross access to the military camps. They did, for a time, allow the Philippine Red Cross to come in to Camp O'Donnell and even to Cabanatuan to administer to some of the prisoners there, but really they only wanted the Philippine Red Cross to assist Filipino soldiers. The Japanese wanted to release the Filipino prisoners as quickly as possible to promote this greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. So the Red Cross only had very limited access to the military camps.
Those servicemen will have had families within the Philippines. Could they do anything to help?
They could, and this is where two of the other women in my book come in. Claire Phillips, who ran a nightclub in Manila. She was a singer and a dancer by profession. Prior to the war, she had met an American serviceman who was fairly new to the Philippines. They embarked on an affair. They had planned to get married. Claire always claimed that they had in fact gotten married, but that does not appear to have been the case. But her husband, as she called him, did end up as a military prisoner, and she wanted to do whatever she could to get supplies into Cabanatuan to help him and to help others. And this was the same situation that Margaret Utinsky, she was known as Peggy, Peggy found herself in as well. Her husband, John, had been a civilian employee of the U.S. military, but when the Japanese attacked, Jack, as he was known, joined up again, and he was taken prisoner too. And so both of these women changed their identity papers. They were operating under false identity papers in Manila as well, and they used their freedom in the city to go around and collect supplies to get them smuggled into especially Cabanatuan, which ends up being the main military prisoner of war camp.
How do you smuggle supplies into a prisoner of war camp?
Very, very carefully. These two women, Claire and Peggy, actually had to work with a pretty vast network. The larger network got started right away, I think, by a lot of Filipinos in Manila. These were people who, because of their race and because of their nationality, were able to move more freely. The way that Cabanatuan was run was similar to the way that the civilian camp was run, in that the Japanese expected that somehow the prisoners would be able to use some of their own money to purchase supplies from the outside. So, for example, we tend to refer to Cabanatuan as shorthand for the military prison camp. But Cabanatuan was also a town. There were market stalls there. There were people living there. And what the underground did was to essentially infiltrate into the town of Cabanatuan and to make sure their people staffed these market stalls. And whenever anybody from the prison camp came out to buy things from these market stalls, the underground made sure that there were always extra supplies getting brought back into the camp, whether they had to actually find ways to fold them into the food items or just find ways of getting extra bags of supplies on the trucks or the carts that were going back into the camp. That's how they did it.
You've already said resources were slim, but how were Peggy and Claire funding these operations? Because they weren't together, were they? They were both separate operations.
They were separate, although Peggy's was most likely the kind of umbrella organization to it all. She had a network that was referred to in Manila as the Miss U network. Claire's activities fell under the rubric of that. The two women did know each other, but they did not have a particularly close relationship. And I think given the kind of work that they were doing, this is quite understandable. You want to be able to make contact with other people, but you can't really afford to have very many close relationships in case everything starts to unravel, which of course it did eventually. But yes, these two women were working separately in Manila. Claire, out of the nightclub that she set up called the Club Subaki, Peggy was essentially running her network out of her own apartment. She was able to go around and solicit donations for the prisoners, and she was also utilizing a Catholic church and convent in her neighborhood. This was known as the Millat E Convent, and there were a group of Irish priests there who were using the cover of their hospital that they had started there as a way of collecting items for the prisoners as well. So it was a pretty vast network that relied on a lot of people doing a lot of different things and eventually getting all of these supplies through their contacts with Peggy or with the Irish priests, and then getting them somehow by train from Manila to Cabanatuan, where they could then be trucked or carted into the prison camp.
Tell me about the beanbags.
The wonderful beanbags. And I think when a lot of people read about that, they'll really get a sense of how ingenious some of these women had to be. One of Gladys Savory's close friends in Manila was the man who served as the Swedish consul. He was a foreign diplomat, and as a member of a neutral party, Helga Jansen was able to convince the Japanese to set up I think the official title was the Neutral Welfare Committee. This gave Jansen the opportunity to send supplies into the military prison camps. The Japanese, though, were very restrictive about what could go into these camps under the auspices of this Neutral Welfare Committee. They only wanted educational and recreational items to be sent in. And Gladys was trying to think of ways, again, she already knew by the nationality loophole that there were ways of following the letter of the regulations, if not the spirit of them. And so she started thinking about items of recreational use, and she remembered beanbag tosses, children recreationally tossing beanbags at each other, a kind of game of catch, or it could be a game of skill trying to get a beanbag tossed in a certain area. But the beanbags that she and her volunteers constructed were up to 100 pounds of edible beans that were put into these bags, and they were labeled recreational items, but they got hauled into the camps. And of course, the prisoners didn't use them recreationally. They just cut them up and cooked the beans and ate them. So, and these women could be so incredibly inventive when they had to be, because they knew how desperate those military prisoners were for any kind of nutrition.
Was it ever enough they managed to get in?
No, there was never enough. I think one of the best ways of understanding just how little actually reached the majority of these men. I mean, these women were working hard, and they were sending in everything they could find, and it was all being used by the prisoners. But there still were so many prisoners who never got access to any of this because it just was gone before everybody got a share of it. There was no way to get it to everyone who was in need. So if you read through, as I have, the many documents by the POWs in Cabanatuan, some of them never even mention this outside assistance because it never got to them in particular. But it did get to some of the men. It did make a difference between life and death, or maybe it made a difference in how long they lived. So it did matter. But no, it was never enough.
Presumably, at least it gives some of them hope that there was somebody out there doing something as best they could for them.
That was something that these women understood very much, the power of hope. Oftentimes, along with the food, they sent messages. They sent little notes in, just a written reminder. You're not forgotten. We're hoping that this finds you well, and we hope to see you soon. And even those short notes were enough to raise spirits inside the camps.
Peggy and Claire were both pulled in for questioning.
I think that for Claire, at least, this was part of a larger. The word that keeps coming back to me is unraveling. This whole system did finally get revealed to the Japanese at Cabanatuan, and as more and more people were pulled in Cabanatuan, the line led back to Manila. But Peggy had actually been arrested prior to that. The Japanese apparently had been watching her for quite a long time. Peggy was a very opinionated woman. She was very forceful. She did not suffer fools gladly, and she seemed to run into a lot of them, she thought, during the war. And she lost her temper a lot. She knew what she wanted to do, how she wanted to do it, how it had to get done. And she got irritated when people didn't move quickly enough for her. So I think she was never off the radar of the Japanese occupation officials. And every time she was out in public, even though she had identity papers that said she was Lithuanian, she was very pale. She had reddish blonde hair. I think visually, every time a Japanese looked at her, their first thought certainly was not Lithuanian. Their first thought was, here's an American woman who should be in an internment camp. Peggy understood the dangers of being seen out in public, and she did try to curtail her visibility. So she was taking steps to avoid being seen in public, but she was by profession a nurse. Her identity papers not only showed that she was Lithuanian instead of American, but also that she was a nurse, and she did take nursing jobs in Manila. And this is how she both earned some money to support herself, and it also fed into her network, the contacts that she made as a nurse through hospitals. This helped to funnel supplies to the prisoners. But she was picked up, and her questioning tended to center on her nationality. The Japanese, while she was interrogated in Fort Santiago, tried to get her to admit that she was an American, which she refused to do. She stuck to her story under torture. The Japanese referred to it as questioning or interrogation, but she was tortured. She barely survived that. It took her quite a while to recover from her treatment in Fort Santiago, and that led her to believe that she was no longer safe in Manila, so she didn't stay in the city for very much longer after that.
Claire Phillips was also picked up.
Yes, she was picked up after the underground network was discovered in Cabanatuan. The Japanese investigation led back to those contacts in Manila. So during the spring of 44, Claire was arrested in the living quarters of her nightclub. She had just sat down to breakfast with her daughter when the Japanese came in and told her to pack up a few things, that she was being taken in for questioning. Some of her first questioning also focused on her nationality. She actually had built a better case for herself, I think, by saying that she had been born in the Philippines Her parents were Italian, so she had that Axis connection. But then she also said that her first husband was a Filipino. So she had built, I think, a pretty good case for herself, nationality-wise. But then the Japanese started asking her about documents that they said they had found that talked about the High Pockets network. And High Pockets was a code name that Claire Phillips started to use when she opened up her nightclub, because she tended to hide important documents in her brassiere. So she referred to those as her high pockets, and that was her code name. The Japanese had found some documents using that name, and they traced it back to her. And when they started questioning her about the underground, that's what really got her into trouble.
They were fairly rough on the pair of them, weren't they?
Yes, both of them. There was a torture technique that was pretty widely known. If you were arrested during the occupation and you got taken to Fort Santiago, just the name of it sent chills down people's spines, because everybody knew what happened in Fort Santiago. And one of the most feared tortures was called the water cure. Both Claire and Peggy were subjected to this, and this just involved having a hose forced down your throat, and water then was poured down the hose, and then a Japanese soldier would step on or kick the stomach. And yeah, it was quite painful. And both of these women really did suffer under their interrogations. And Claire was also subjected to a mock execution, which it was hard to recover from that, even knowing that it was a fake. Unlike Peggy, Claire was not released. She was actually sentenced to, I think it was about 10 years of hard labor. And so she was sent on to a women's prison just outside of Manila, where she was supposed to spend the duration of her sentence.
They withheld information. They didn't, obviously, the phrase is probably crack, but it's not quite as simple as that, is it?
It's not quite as simple as cracking. Peggy seems to have really downplayed any connection she might have had with the underground when she was being questioned. And the evidence for that is there doesn't seem to be anybody else important who was arrested after Peggy was. She seems to have held pretty well under interrogation. After she was released, I think because of the torture, she knew very well that if she was arrested again, she would not be able to hold up. I think she was very afraid of cracking the second time around. And Claire had trouble in the interrogation, and she did name names, but she tried to be very careful to only give names of people she knew had already been arrested. She had kind of been keeping track in her circle of people who disappeared into Fort Santiago, so she knew pretty well who was already gone. So she tried not to give them any more information than she thought they already had. But again, she could never be absolutely sure what she was saying. And she talked about this in her memoir, that this was very difficult, trying to stick to a certain story, trying to stick to certain names, what the Japanese would accept, what they would not accept, hoping that she never deviated from a story that she already gave them, because then they would punish her more. And the torture was very painful.
Yeah, and they survived the war, and subsequently, Claire's called the Manila Matahari, it almost seems seedy to me. Almost, in your book, you talk about the post-war fallout of them all, and there was a point where actually I didn't want to make notes anymore because it just felt so seedy picking through, because they obviously had all done worthy things, but then there's this sort of fallout and recriminations afterwards.
That also gets into, I think we always want to look at heroes, and we assume that if somebody is a real hero, they've never ever done anything wrong. I think in a situation like Manila during World War II, it would have been really hard not to do something that other people could consider as being wrong, as a way of achieving something that was maybe more right. For example, one of these recriminations that came up after the war, speculations that Claire was in fact running a brothel through her nightclub, and that she was trading sex for better treatment from the Japanese. And I think this is one of the big issues that came up among survivors of the occupation, exactly what Claire had been doing in that nightclub. But we don't have any definitive information about that. We can't say for certain that this was going on. And even if we say, well, maybe there was some prostitution going on at a nightclub, that in itself would not be, I think, terribly unusual under many circumstances. Maybe this was also a way that Claire had of getting information out of the Japanese that would be useful to the American military. So if this is how she thought she had to get what she needed to get, that's what she did. Some people might criticize her for that, and maybe others wouldn't.
I did also wonder if she was slightly more under the spotlight, because she wasn't the only one that published her memoirs, but she's the only one that had a film made about her.
Yes, this is another thing. I think that maybe she was more under the spotlight because of the film, but also because she was very good at creating her own publicity. She liked the attention she was getting. This had been her profession. She was an entertainer. She had gone to the Philippines in the late 1930s in the first place because she wanted to be on the stage, and she wasn't developing enough of a career in the United States, so she thought she would try in the Philippines. And it's clear that she always wanted to be famous. Once she was liberated from that prison, and she had that first newspaper story where her name was included, I think she did start to cultivate a public persona, and it was based on her wartime activities. So she did get a lot of attention, and other people who had survived the war didn't necessarily look kindly on that kind of spotlight on her. Certainly this all culminates in a Hollywood movie, which was really, I think, her dream come true. Really, who wouldn't want to have a movie made about their life? It's got to be a great thing for her. It did. I think it did cause some hard feelings because she was the hero of the movie.
People feel slighted that why they're not in it, or why their part is not a bigger part in it.
Right. Who gets to decide who the minor characters are as opposed to the major characters? So you see some very human emotions coming through when this all falls out at the end of the war.
I think it's probably fair to point out that she was, I mean, the FBI did investigate the bond. She was cleared of any pro-Japanese activities, wasn't she? She was found innocent.
The FBI was very clear that they did not believe she in any way colluded with the Japanese during the war. So I think that's been made crystal clear. The FBI was worried about issues of fraud, And they did follow her for quite a while. It was fascinating to read that FBI file and to kind of track her movements and to track what other people were saying about Claire after the war and seeing what the FBI made of all of that.
Yeah, you'd have thought when the war was over that would have been it. It shows a strange, almost paranoia on their part, chasing up these loose ends.
I think that gender probably plays a role in a whole lot of this, but especially at the end, I don't know that Americans really had a way of talking about how war affects women, and especially women who had survived in occupied territory. These are not traditionally things that women do or that women are exposed to. It's one thing to consider what happened to the American military prisoners who survived and came back because they were men, they had been soldiers. That's a different kind of discussion. But what about when these are women? How do you even describe what they went through? How do you expect them to transition into a more traditional life after that experience? And I think that's why life was difficult for Claire after the war. Not only had she wanted the fame that she finally gets, but she only gets it because of that horrendous experience that she had been through. And she also has to deal with that. And I think that was very hard on her.
Well, that seems like a fitting place to finish. Thank you, Theresa. Angels of the Underground, The American Women Who Resisted the Japanese in the Philippines in World War II by Theresa Kaminski is published by Oxford University Press. I'll put links on the website www.podcast.com. Don't forget, if you like the podcast, why not join the conversation on Facebook? Facebook.com/WW2podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.